Our next speaker is Gabriel. He's a data scientist and lead of the data science team at Zülke. He has several years of experience in conducting data analytics and machine learning projects. Unlike most other applications of machine learning, mistakes made by automated systems in the medical field can directly harm people. Gabriel will show what exactly is different in a medical machine learning project. Yes, Gabriel. You can come in. Hi. Hi there. I wasn't sure if you were remote or if you're here, but you're here. So welcome.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the introduction. I'm very welcome. I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about machine learning for health. As has been said, I'm a data scientist at Zülke, and where we're doing machine learning projects, but we're also doing medical projects. So the first project actually that has been done at Zülke was a medical project. So recently we've been doing medical machine learning projects, and this is basically learnings from these projects and processes that we put in place to actually being able to build machine learning software that can be used in the medical field in this talk. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Now, there's a lot of potential for using methods from machine learning and artificial intelligence in the medical domain. And why do I think that there's a lot of potential? So I've listed 3 of the main reasons on this slide. One big reason is the data. So there's a lot of data that's being generated in the healthcare setting. There's an estimate that in this year there's going to be more than 2,000 exabytes of new data generated in the medical field. And you can see an example of an electronic health record on this slide. So this can be anything from like doctor's notes to radiology images, any data that is being generated about patients, for instance. And what's nice is that there's not only a lot of data, but that data that's really somehow the perfect match for machine learning. A lot of it is image data, and image data, computer vision is a field that has had a tremendous progress in the recent years. I mean, your phone can basically do image classification and face recognition already. So the data, there's not only a lot of data, it's also the modality of the data that's very well suited to machine learning. And also the task, for instance, diagnosing a patient is basically classification, right? So you have different kind of diseases that the patient could have, and then you classify. So it's also the task that needs to be solved is very made for machine learning. And you also get labels. So for diagnostics, for radiology, you have these huge data sets, and maybe they're not perfectly structured, but that in some form the doctor writes down what he diagnosed. So you have all these labeled data. There's also a lot of research. So on the top, I listed just a few of the very many research papers that came out this year at the International Conference of Machine Learning, which is one of the 2 largest international conferences in this field. And there's a lot of research specifically for using machine learning in the medical domain. And this is a general machine learning conference, it's not specifically for this field. And the third big reason of why there's this big hope that machine learning could be useful is that it's a really large field. So there's an estimate that in 2017, there were $7.8 trillion spent on healthcare, and it's a field that's growing faster than the general economy. It's a really expensive field. There's a lot more patients, there's a lot more money being spent every year. So one would hope that there's a lot of potential for automating things, for using machine learning to improving these processes. Now, the question is, so what's the catch, right? I mean, why do we still have doctors? Why, if you go to a doctor, he's not using machine learning to diagnose you or to treat you? And there's obviously many reasons for this. I've listed a few of the challenges that I think are important, and definitely one of the most important ones is safety. So in comparison to, say, if you make a model that predicts how likely someone is to click on an ad and you serve them the wrong ad, in the worst case, that's a bit annoying to the person that sees the ad. If you make a model that misdiagnoses a patient, this can be really dangerous. So safety is really crucial in this domain. Also explainability, which, I mean, all these things are also important in other domains, but I think they're especially important here. And explainability means you don't want to give a doctor a black box that just gives him an output of saying this person has cancer. You also want the doctor to understand why the model thinks this patient has cancer, so he can understand what the model did, and he can also explain this to the patient. You have the problem of reproducibility, and here I mean specifically being able to reproduce the nice results you might get on, say, very curated machine learning data sets in research papers actually to the real world in a clinical setting. So being able to actually get the same results in the much more messy field of actually using these methods. And then another important aspect is clinical relevance. So it's not always useful to just forecast things. So clinicians and machine learning people and data scientists need to work closely together to actually identify what are important problems in a clinical setting that need to be addressed with machine learning and not just randomly solve forecasting or prediction problems with medical data. The most important one, though, is probably safety, and this is also going to be the main focus of this talk. And this is a quote from a radiologist at a machine learning workshop that I've recently seen, which I think summarizes this very nicely. And what he says is medical machine learning without constant thought towards safety is not actually medical machine learning. It's just machine learning which happens to be on medical data. So safety is really central. And if you want to do machine learning, you also need to you need to basically do safe machine learning because otherwise you cannot use it in the medical field, and maybe just because the regulatory bodies will not allow you to use your machine learning model. Let's start with some examples of projects that can be medical machine learning, and this is all projects that I've been involved in, and these are projects where basically it's important to think about these issues. And one project which we did together with the Insel Hospital in Bern, and they wanted to look at patient records and use text models on these patient records to be able to systematically classify diseases. There's a standard book that has all the diseases a person can have standardized, and what they wanted to do, for instance, for getting reimbursed by a health insurance company to systematically be able to classify these medical records with machine learning. It's a process that is being done at the moment with a team of roughly 30 experts that have to manually look at all these patient records and do these classifications. And what we did together with them is actually build a machine learning model that can also do this classification. We've worked with AVA on a very interesting project. So what AVA is doing, they're building a wearable device for fertility tracking. So the device measures a person's temperature, blood perfusion, heartbeat, breathing rate overnight, and is then able to model the ovulation cycle and actually predict fertile days. And so you can use this, for instance, for, if you're trying to conceive, knowing which are the fertile days, but you could also think of using this product actually as contraception. And obviously then there's different kinds of risks associated with using this device, which are important for actually how you need to build this product, because then you have the risk of unwanted pregnancies, which are grave. Another example, and my last example, is a project we did with a large pharmaceutical company in Switzerland, and it's a field of diagnostics. And what they're building is a device that uses spirometry data, so basically how much air you can blow out in a certain amount of time, plus other patient information to be able to do differential diagnostics between different kinds of lung diseases, for instance, asthma or COPD. So the device can actually help the doctor diagnosing a patient. Now, if you want to build these products and not just have them as a research prototype, there's a lot of regulatory documents, there's a lot of laws, there's a lot of standards that you need to adhere to. I've listed them here. We're not going to go into them, but it's important that to keep this in mind. So there's like one large law, it's the Medical Device Directive, and then there's a lot of standards and guidelines that interplay with each other. And you need to be aware, so if you're building something like this, you need to be aware of all these standards, and you also need to have people that really understand these. And they need to, as the first step, they need to decide, is this even a medical device under the laws, or there can be fitness trackers that are not regulated. And then even if your product is deemed a medical device, you need to understand what kind of medical device is. So there's different kind of medical device classes based on the risk associated with this device. So you need to do risk management, you need to evaluate and identify all possible risks that your device has. You need to implement and identify mitigation measures for these risks. You need to implement quality management systems, regulated development, and so on. So there's a lot of different laws and regulations that you need to be aware of when you build a machine learning product. Unfortunately, there's no specific laws or guidelines regarding machine learning or AI. So what we did is we looked at all these regulations, and basically they're general enough such that you can apply them also to machine learning products. And certainly in the future, so there's people working on actually creating specific standards and regulation for machine learning. So what does that mean specifically for a machine learning project? I've identified some of the important phases in any machine learning project, and we're going to look into a bit of detail on how these regulations affect these parts of a machine learning project. Now, the first part certainly is data processing. So any machine learning project needs data. So what you do is you create some kind of master data set given a lot of different data sources. And also, you need labels. So if you want to do supervised learning, you need labels. And in the case of a medical project, you can't just take any data as labeled data. So your reference standard really needs to be specified. So you need to say who labeled your data, the qualification of the doctor, the process that the doctor used, at what clinic the doctor labeled this data, and so on. So you really need to understand and specify beforehand how these labels were generated. And then you also split your data. You have some test development data that you give to your data scientists, some test data that you use for evaluation, and the code you use to join and split this data is very crucial. So there can be a lot of mistakes happening here that you will not be able to spot in evaluation because they can affect your data. So there can be label leakage, all kinds of things. So the code that you write here needs to be written with certain quality standards. So you need unit tests, you need code reviews, you need a regulated development process on how you write this code. And you obviously also need controlled access to this data. And you need to be able to say how large your test data needs to be able to distinguish if different kinds of methods are statistically significantly different. You need to analyze your data. So these are all things that you also do. If you're a good data scientist, you do this in any data science project. But here you need to do it in a more standardized way. You need to actually document this. And you need to look at, so are there correlations in my data? Are there different groups in my data? Like, do the data come from different hospitals? You don't want to maybe mix them in your development and test data, and things like this. And the most important part is you need to have a specific intended use for your product that you need to know beforehand. And then you need to check if the data that you have is actually representative of this population. So if you say, I want a product that can be used for people, for children between the ages of 5 and 12, then you need to make sure that your data is actually covering all this population. So you need to look at the distributions of your data. And as a last step, you need to do a clinical validation study, so this is something you don't want to do often because this is really expensive. So this actually means testing the whole system, including the doctor. So you want to have as good an estimate of how well your model will perform in the real world before you go to clinical validation study. There's a data science research part in any of these projects. So you first need to figure out what actually works on your data, what methods. And as data scientists, you all know this, so I'm not going to go into detail. It's a really explorative phase. You have you iterate, you do experiments, and so on. And then you choose one approach, which is the combination of the models you train, the code for transformation, feature selection, and so on. And what's important here is that it's not just the performance of your model that's important, but you also need to be able to choose your model based on things like simplicity and robustness. So if you want to be able to explain your models, it's maybe better you have a more simple model than a more complex one. If you want to be able to have a robust model, you need to also evaluate how well your model works if you change your input data slightly, if you increase the amount of noise, and so on. And you also need to be able to explain these models. This is a phase that so you don't need to develop the code that you write here under a really rigorously regulated system, because most of the code is going to be thrown away, right? You will only use basically the approach you choose in the end. But what's important is that everything's documented. So in the end, you need to be able to show a notified body when you apply for having your product in the market, what you did. So you want the version control system, you want very well-documented experiments, you want to be able to justify what data removed, why you did that, what happens to the performance if you remove the data. You need to justify why you chose a specific model, and so on. And what's very important is the metric you use for evaluation needs to come from a clinician. So how grave false positives or false negatives are, this cannot come from the data scientist. So how you evaluate this needs to involve a clinician. You then go and evaluate the performance again. So you also want to look at robustness and sensitivity. Maybe as one example of what's important is, maybe there's hidden stratification in your data. So maybe there's groups in your data that you don't know. So maybe if you want to build a product that diagnoses cancer, you have benign and severe cases of cancer, and your product only works well on the benign ones. So you will not see this in the error rate. So you need to go and actually inspect the mistakes together with a clinician. And you also need, obviously, validated code for computing these metrics. Here's an example for why explainable AI is useful for finding bugs. So here's an example of a computer vision system that is used to classify diseases based on chest X-rays. And you can see that the system here detected pen marks by the doctor and was not looking at actually any meaningful data in the image. So this is very useful to find bugs. Now, as a last part, you actually need to build your medical device. We're not going to go into details, but what's important is that here, the output of your more researchy phase needs to be validated and tested very well. And then actually the code that you build here will go into a medical product. So now you need to adhere to all the standards that are in place to build software as a medical device. One detail, you need to also validate all the libraries you use. And in machine learning, we use a lot of open source libraries. So what you need to do is, for any of the code that you use that you didn't write yourself, you need to actually document why you use this library. You need to verify that it performs well. You need to test it. You need to look at the bug trackers, and so on. So this is something that people sometimes underestimate. So this will take a lot of time. Anyway, so coming to an end, what are the most important aspects of medical AI? I've listed them here. So one very important part is good machine learning practices. So if you do machine learning well, and if you have good data scientists, they will do most of the things required anyway. The difference is you really need to document what you're doing. And you really need to have checklists to make sure that people actually do these things. You need to properly evaluate your system as early as possible and constantly test what you're doing. You want reproducible machine learning pipelines to be able to change certain things and then still being able to rerun everything and have it nicely documented. You want to have a history of data, models, and code to be able to show the regulator what you've did. You need risk management, and you need to test, document everything being code, data, or models, and you want simple, transparent, and interpretable models. It's very hard to go into detail in a 20-minute talk, but luckily we're writing a white paper on this, and this will come out soon, and where we can go a bit into more detail also. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Gabriel. Very well. And since you're in such a flow, let's just tackle some of the questions. How do you make sure that doctor-by-doctor diagnosis variability that is certainly present in such data is being taken care of?
So, I mean, what you need to do is you need to be able to show not only that the distribution of your data, like the patient data, is what you will expect when you apply the product, but also you want to measure this. So in your protocol of collecting labeled data, you want different medical doctors from different clinics to be able to estimate this kind of variance between doctors.
To what extent changes in the EU medical device regulation entering into force in May 2021 is affecting AI-based medical applications?
So, I mean, I have to say I'm not an expert very deeply in this regulatory affairs. So I don't know. So I don't think in the new medical device regulation there's going to be anything specific for AI in Europe. So I know that the FDA has frameworks in place that are very rough and high level for AI in this field. I don't think the EU will have this in the new regulations.
In what form do you think AI can help most in the domain of digital health?
I think mostly diagnostics, especially with image data. It's just because the models work so well for this. So I think there's a lot of potential in this domain.
And what do you tell people who are skeptical about using AI in the medical field?
Well, I would say, you know, the goal is to always still have a doctor and to build products that are understandable and robust. And if you do all this and do risk management properly, I don't think there's a higher risk for people if AI is being used in a doctor's office.
Thank you very much.